and more people are coming to our first workshop on NaDiMa project, Natural Disaster Management Project in 2021. My name is Mohammad Reza Farzanegan, and I'm very happy that we collaborate with very good colleagues in both Germany and Iran. And basically, we started this collaboration a few years ago, and that was under the name of different project, Natural Resource Management, Political Economy of Natural Resource Management, in 2016. And that project basically was also supported by German Academic Exchange Service, the ADE, via Auswärtiges Amt in Germany. And we collaborated for 3 years with the University of Mashhad, University of Tehran, and Tabiat Modarres University, also in Tehran. And we had a very good time, 3 years, and we organized 6 seasonal schools, 2 schools per year, before Corona, of course. And we concluded that project. And now, again, we had the opportunity to suggest a different project, but it's still related to the climate and natural resources, but this time focusing more on the management of natural disaster from socio-economic perspective and from the technical perspective. So that is probably a more innovative aspect in which that once we focus on disaster in specific different types of disaster, earthquake, flood, and sandstorms, and many other forms which are more common in the region, especially in Iran. Some of them are also common in Germany, such as floods. And there are good things to learn from experience of these countries, how they manage it, how they are doing the research on that, what type of techniques and methods are available to do academic research, which is also relevant for policymakers. So the idea of the new project, NaDiMa, Natural Disaster Management, basically is to connect academics from both countries, Iran and Germany, together, and students and researchers to not only discuss on related topics on the natural disaster and learn from each other, but also the spirit of this project is to reach a common understanding of different cultural attitudes, norms, and behavior in Iran, Germany on these topics, and other type of cultural exchange here. As you can also imagine, that is a new situation also for us during the COVID-19, and as everything is now virtual in university and so on and so forth, we shift also to a series of online dialogues. And our plan is, as in 2020, to organize online workshops and discussions and so on and so forth in 2021. So today is our first workshop on the NaDiMa 2021. And the plan, as I said, is that every month we organize these workshops. So another difference that this year compared to last year is that we are focusing more on more applied types of workshops, the workshops which basically deliver important skills for students and researchers. At the same time, it gives more space for teamwork and joint work during these workshops in order to also gain better understanding of techniques and methods for disaster management, understanding natural disaster or other types of disasters. So we try to focus more, give more space to these type of practical, research-oriented practical workshops. Before I introduce Dr. Dawood Ansari, who is going to lead this workshop for today and tomorrow, and he will be able also to give more indeed information regarding the content and organization and so on and so forth. I would like also to, in this round, introduce our colleagues who are involving in this project and are supporting us in this project, and basically also to give also this space here for them maybe to introduce themselves. So from Marburg, I see here Mr. Sven Fischer. Sven is a PhD candidate at our department and have been with us with the Iran project since 2016. Sven, floor is yours if you want to say hello to the audience briefly.
Yeah, hello everyone also from my side. Can you hear me? Is it working? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much also, Mohammed, for the introduction. I'm happy also to be here again and that we could continue our project this year. And yeah, I am not seeing just colleagues from University of Marburg, also a couple of students I see in the list of participants. So I'm happy also our students could participate. Yeah, I hope that we will have an interesting workshop today. I'm also happy to see Davut again. I think we saw each other in Marburg maybe 2 years ago or even longer. I cannot even remember. Yeah, I'm looking forward to your contribution today. Thank you.
2.5 years.
Thank
oh my
you,
God.
Sven. Thank you very much. Sven is also doing his PhD projects on the topic of disaster, natural disaster in Iran. Just recently also published a nice work, a special issue, which I later on share the link to you. Dr. Fekete, Professor Fekete is also here from TH Köln. Alexander, if you want to say something.
Yes, well, thank you very much for being part of this really nice cooperation and project. We're glad to be here with you together. Welcome everyone, especially the guests from Iran. We know it's a special year, 1400, and we're very much looking forward to keep this a couple of more years with the colleagues in Marburg. Thanks very much for the kind invitation. Today we're joining with 2 people, and the other person is Peter Priesmeier. He's going to conduct his PhD also in cooperation with another project in Iran. And we're very much interested in the topic of the presentation of the scenarios today. So which scenarios are relevant for both countries? Thank you very much. Oh, well, maybe I forgot to introduce our university, but it's a technical university based in Cologne, and we're educating in the field of rescue engineering, which is kind of bringing together disaster risk management with emergency management as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexander, for this introduction. We are very happy to collaborate with TH Köln in 2021. So that they are also our new partners in this specific project from this year. So, and they are doing some very interesting stuff also with Iran on the topic of disaster. So I guess that is a great opportunity to collaborate more. From Iranian side, I see Dr. Nazari from Faculty of Natural Resources from University of Tehran. I still do not see Professor Alaeddini from University of Tehran. He wanted also to join us, so I hope that we will see him later on. And Mr. Shahvar, Dr. Shahvar, also from a Strong Motion Network outside at the beginning, but I don't have him in the list right now. But Dr. Nazari, if you hear us and if you can speak by microphone, please feel free to introduce your department, yourself, and if your webcam is also working, would be much more better that the others also see you into that.
As you said, very nice introduction section. The NaDiMa project in 2021 has encountered or faced a new generations or new phases of the communications. And as you said, a new series of the dialogue will be managed and arranged. But if I want to say a very short introduction about myself, as you said, my name is Ali Akbar Nazari Samani, Associated Professor at the Faculty of Natural Resources, University of Tehran, and this is the second year that I cooperate directly with NaDiMa, and I mostly, and my department mostly, focus on the natural hazard, but in the applied sections. For example, effect of dust storm, flood, land subsidence, land mass movements on the rural sectors or on urban plannings, for example, their effects on the degradations of the natural resources and direct effects on social communities. But my major is mostly on sand and dust storm. And the last year we could have a organized sessions on dust storm and also the flood in Iran. I hope that this technical dialogue and workshop could give the participants a new insights, and in one side and on the other side some applied techniques for better management. Also, also I think that we have a good cooperations with students, communities in the University of Tehran, and as much as I know, a lot of them are eager to participate in these workshops and other. I will be present. I will be here until the end of the workshop, and again, thank you from you, Dr. Farzanegan, and your colleagues at the University of Marburg and also DAAD for giving us this opportunity to share our knowledge with other researchers, students, and experts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nazari, for this good introduction, also from your side, Institute. And I see also Dr. Shahvar is here from Iran Strong Motion Network. Dr. Shahvar, if you hear us and if you want to say a few words regarding your work and Institute briefly, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammed from. Yeah, thank you. I'm Ashar from Iran Strong Motion Network from BHRC, Indian House Research Institute in Iran. I am very happy to be at your second workshop. We have a good experience last year. Actually, we will try to introduce the natural hazard in Iran. I hope to have a better planning. It's the starting of the better planning for the crisis in result of them. Iran Strong Motion Network will try to focus more on secondary earthquake hazard, and I hope we will have a successful workshop this year, and we will focus on rapid response. I hope we have a good workshop on it, and I hope we have a useful workshop on it. If you need more description, I can describe it later.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Shahvar, for also introduction of Iran Strong Motion Network, which is specialized in the field of earthquake monitoring and measuring and advising also the Iranian government regarding this issue.
Yes, I do hear you. Yes. Yes,
Yes,
I do hear
maybe
you.
briefly
Can you
also you
hear me?
introduce your department and the works
Sure,
that you are doing on the disaster.
sure. So, I'm a member of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Tehran. Our main interest in disaster issues is obviously socioeconomic. And our faculty and my own department, which is the Department of Planning and Development and Social Policy, we have done work on post-disaster risk reduction and also monitoring and evaluation of post-disaster reconstruction activities. I think, first of all, the series is very, I think, a very good learning experience for our students. And in particular, this event is also very good for us. One issue in Iran and in our research that has come up is the difficulties we have in developing scenarios and developing proper programs for from a social and economic point of view to reduce disaster risk. So I think these are these events and this program in particular is quite useful for us. And I'm very happy to be here, and our students, I think several of them are have joined, are here in the event, and I'm very happy that they're here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Puyo, also for this good introduction on the works that you are doing in the Faculty of Social Science, which is also has a clear implication for policy issues, the recovery after disaster. So you have been also involved in that type of projects, and this is good for our future events to collaborate further on that. So today a workshop is about developing the scenarios regarding management of natural disaster or reducing the risk of disaster. And as Dr. Dawood Ansari will also explain it further, basically the application of the skills that this workshop is planning to deliver is beyond of management of natural disaster risk, and it is very well applied in other fields of security, conflict, violence, and so on and so forth. And I had also the opportunity to participate one of the workshops that their organization some time ago before Corona regarding the conflict in Yemen. That was also I suppose related to the developing scenarios, different scenarios regarding the situation of conflict in Yemen. But as he will explain, this topic is also applicable to the disaster issues and so on and so forth. Dawood Ansari, I know him for a couple of years, and we had also the opportunity of indeed exchanging with him in our earlier projects, again with Iran as invited speakers and so. He basically is an interdisciplinary researcher. In his profile, he's a consultant, at the same time lecturer, and international development practitioner. So he's working both academic research and also in his NGO. He has a PhD in energy and resource economics from Humboldt University of Berlin. And basically he works for at the moment he works for the German Institute of Economic Research, the Deutsche Institut für Wirtschaftsforschung in Berlin, in addition to advising and coaching clients from public and private sector. Furthermore, he has established a think tank and NGO. It's called Energy Access and Development Program, which is basically focusing on sustainable development in the Middle East with a focus on climate change and energy management. And as you can imagine, he has basically published in these fields extensively in the recent time in the field of energy economics and natural resources. So on the today workshop is the best to explain it, the agenda and basically the structure of this. So I don't talk much about that type of information here. I'm very much interested to see how this event proceeding today and tomorrow. It would be a type of more intensive event in which needs a very good type of participation also from the audience and the students. And I'm pretty sure that the skills will be learned during this event will be much helpful for the development of research profile of the participants and career opportunities in future. So on the agenda, Dawood, the floor is yours. So I would keep myself now silent and listen to your organization. Just as a matter of technical things, we have two of our assistants in Marburg are also here, Mr. Emrich and Ms. Catherine Appel here on the NaDiMa team. If there is any technical issues regarding this event, just feel free to inform them here. And if there is any question regarding the issues related to the workshop, use the chat room here and yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction.
Thank you very much.
Obviously,
I will be here. So just turn off my video in order to focus on.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Also, thank you so much for having me. You're completely right. It's been quite a while since our last events together in Marburg. This is why it's such a pleasure for me to finally give this workshop today. Let me share my screen. Okay, great. So yeah, also from my side then. Welcome to NaDiMa Dialogue number 8, developing scenarios for disaster risk reduction. Let me very briefly walk you through the schedule for today. So as you know, this is day 1 of day 2, and obviously, so this is a combined program, which means we're going to start issues which we're going to end tomorrow. So I hope to be able to see all of you A, for the entire time of the workshop, and B, also on both days. So this is going to be 2 intense days working on scenarios, mainly for people who have never been exposed to scenarios before. So after this brief intro, we're going to start with the section called Introducing Scenarios. So introducing the very idea of foresight analysis, then going forward to understanding scenarios, going to developing scenarios, and eventually that's where we're going to stop today. So you as participants, this will actually, at least I hope so, this is not going to be me talking to you for 2 days straight, but instead I hope to keep this interactive as possible. And so especially the core of this workshop is actually going to be you working on actual scenarios. So after finishing the lecture session today, so I hope by 4:30 p.m. 2:30 p.m., 3 p.m. I will introduce you to different case studies are prepared. You will work in groups. You will select a case study to work on, and then you will, so today afternoon and tomorrow morning, and also tomorrow afternoon, you will have the chance to work on your group project, and then eventually the very last 2 hours of our session tomorrow, they're going to be devoted to presenting your work, and to make all this a little more interesting. We want to have this as a competition. So eventually we have 5 groups, and you as 5 groups, you will compete against each other. And the group which is able to prepare the best scenarios is going to receive an additional certificate by us. In case you're interested, yes, we perhaps even are going to have some breaks. Maybe yes, maybe no. We'll see. There might be some breaks in between. Particularly, I would expect us to have a major break at 1 p.m. CET today. So in 2.5 hours from now, we're probably going to do a major break. And then perhaps another short break in the afternoon. I will not read out all the expected outcomes because hopefully you studied all the expected outcomes while registering for the course. Let's just summarize. You're going to be able to understand a lot in terms of basic terms around scenarios, which is perhaps for many of you the most interesting thing. Let me rather explain to you what we're not going to do in the workshop. So just to set the expectations straight. So this workshop is especially designed for participants who have no to only very limited knowledge on scenarios before. So we're not going to look at quantitative scenarios. We will briefly cover how quantitative and qualitative scenarios are, how they're interrelated, but we will not really go into how to do quantitative modeling or different things, which that's pretty straightforward. What we will also not do is we will also not discuss the variety of different methods that is out there to establish scenarios, as we will learn in a couple of minutes. The term scenario itself is a very blurry one, and so is the idea of how to prepare scenarios. So there's not one particular method, and we're going to work with one particular method, but we're not going to discuss the whole variety of methods and its ups and downs or its pros and cons. What we can also not do eventually, again, so this workshop is mainly targeted at giving you an idea of what scenarios are and a brief idea of how to, or very, very condensed idea of how to develop them. So we cannot establish a very firm understanding of these really very, very different types and nuances that we do see in disaster management when it comes to scenarios. We will not eventually look at how to use scenarios to we'll look at particularly, which is actually a pre-step that often occurs before doing scenarios. We will not look at how to identify or compare between different risks. So when you look at a community and you're asking yourself, okay, which this community is vulnerable with respect to which risks. So this is a question that often appears before you enter the scenario making. It's a question that we cannot take care of during this workshop. And lastly, we cannot cover the obvious process of how risk actually manifests in different communities, how exactly emergency response is conducted, or what exactly is the decision-making process when it comes to for instance, adopting new policies to its handling risk. So for all of these things, if you're interested in them, I can recommend you to I can recommend you to I can recommend you to look at advanced courses, other literature, in order to gain a deeper understanding of these issues. Okay, so allow me to get to know you a little more. So first, I would like to know, where are you sitting at the moment? And for doing this, to make it easy, we'll just over the entire workshop day, we're just going to use these wonderful small icons. So on the top of your list, you should find a bar where you can select certain reactions, such as raising your hand, signaling that you approve something or similar. So just try to find this bar on the top of your screen and use it to tell me. So if you're currently sitting in Iran, then just raise your hand. If you're sitting in Germany, give it a thumbs up. And if you're somewhere else, give me a laughing smiley. Okay, so I can see thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. Yes, raise your hand, raise your hand. This is A, it's me getting to know you, and B, it's me understanding if you actually have access to the program. So we have one raised hand. If you're currently sitting your arm, please raise your hand. Okay, response is still limited. Okay, never mind. Let's go to the next one. So the next question is, what's your academic background? So we're from a lot of different backgrounds, and that's actually very important for a session on scenarios. So if your main background, and by the way, please identify yourself as whatever you like. So if you mainly identify yourself as an economist, please raise your hand. If you're from a disaster management background, please give it a thumbs up. If you're from engineering, please give me your disapproval. Yes, that has many meanings at the same time, and they're all intended probably. If you're coming from geography, urban studies, and urban engineering, please give me a smiley. And if you're from another background, please clap. So this is, we're having some raised hands. Okay. Okay, also pretty mixed picture. Okay, let's go to the next question, which is, how much do you know about scenarios? So this is the last question for the start. So if you say, okay, I'm basically an expert on scenarios and actually I should give that workshop instead of you, then please feel free to raise your hand. If you say, okay, I do actually know scenarios pretty well, give it a thumbs up. If you say, okay, I have some background on scenarios, but not too much, give me your disapproval. If you say I know a little about scenarios, use a smiley, use an emoticon. And if you say, okay, I have absolutely no idea about scenarios so far, please applause. Okay, so results wise, okay, disapproval. So many people have little to no previous exposure to scenarios. We have two participants who say they do actually know a little bit of it, quite a lot about scenarios. Okay, that's a really good point to begin with. Okay, so what I should maybe say at this point. So obviously, if you have any questions throughout the workshop, if there's anything of interest, feel free to interrupt me at any point in time. If there's anything you want to discuss, so please let's even during the lecture, let's try to keep this as interactive as possible. And so yeah, I'm switching to the. Let's now really dive into it. With the intro after the intro, introducing scenarios. So let's start over here. A mutated SARS virus emerges in East Asia over the winter. Travelers spread the virus worldwide, with first cases appearing in Europe and North America around April. Government exercised different containment policies, including various forms of lockdowns and travel bans. And then, as we know, tackling this virus is especially complicated because it shows a high number of asymptomatic patients. It has significant incubation time, and that makes containing the virus virtually impossible. Well, what's then happening is the virus has advanced. As we know, it has become increasingly endemic. Societies have made drastic turns to its social distancing, hygiene policies, and similar things. At this very moment, you perhaps think or assume I'm talking about COVID-19. That's actually not true. I've not been mentioning COVID-19 whatsoever. What I've been mentioning is an excerpt from Modi SARS. I know that sounds pretty cute. Modi SARS is the very result, is a report prepared by the Robert Koch Institute of Germany's Center for Disease Control in 2012. So in 2012, the German Center for Disease Control was asked to prepare a scenario for a future pandemic, and what they've come up is the so-called Modi SARS scenario. And as you can see, Modi SARS is to a frightening degree, measuring exactly how the COVID-19 pandemic has unfolded. And that is to some extent the power of scenarios. As you will learn later, it's actually not the idea of scenarios to be exactly met by the truth. Actually, we're usually very happy if most of the scenarios that we prepare do not come true. But scenarios are able to see things that we otherwise wouldn't. And that is the very point. So if you think of how, in terms of the corona crisis, if you consider how exactly a lot of the communication was handled, it was the COVID crisis, something no one has expected, no one could have foreseen that. Well, actually, it was foreseen. Scenario development made it able to foresee this crisis, which is why it's even more of an issue that so less was done to be prepared for it. And that's the very reason why we're sitting here today, in order to talk about scenarios and how to be prepared for such events. So what exactly is foresight analysis? So foresight analysis is mainly coming actually from the intelligence sector. And foresight analysis is the very, very reason why all of these events that you see in front of us should actually not surprise you. That's the very, very idea of foresight analysis. The idea of foresight analysis is made to significantly decrease the amount of unexpected events that you find in front of you. So for instance, this is especially powerful with an American audience. Think of 9/11, for instance. So 9/11 was often or is often handled as something no one could have foreseen. How could this ever happen? Well, factually, if you look at if you look at all the nascent, if you look at all the underlying trends previous to 9/11, any good analyst could have told you there is a significant chance that there will be a direct attack on American soil, on a major building, on a major sign. So that it was the World Trade Center eventually is something that we might not necessarily have foreseen, but the fact that there will be some kind of attack on American soil is something that good analysts have actually foreseen. If you look at recent documentary, you'll find that out too. And that actually applies to almost all major global events. If you just spot the signs well enough, you are actually able to see them before they happen. So foresight analysis is the answer to the question, can we anticipate disruptive change? And here the real term is disruptive change. So the idea is we use foresight analysis to track these things that are able to change our system entirely. The idea of foresight analysis is to go beyond what linear projections of the very reality that we're in could mean, but eventually to look at change that is really disrupting the system that surrounds us. We can identify foresight as a reframing process that involves the exploitation of insights to create the state of being prepared for thinking, seeing, and acting in the future. This is a point that we will come back to multiple times today. So foresight is neither forecasting nor is it prediction. Okay, we will talk about that multiple times, but just to kind of to put the truth now. Foresight is not forecasting. It's not predicting. These are completely different techniques. Foresight delivers us a world of what if. Foresight is eventually, and scenarios are an instrument that we use to travel, to navigate in what we call the VUCA world. So VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So scenarios are the very tool when it comes to interacting with a system that is so complex and so uncertain that all other techniques are actually not feasible anymore. A lot of what's happening here is actually going back. A lot of what we're going to talk about in terms of methods is actually going back to a Nobel Prize laureate, Daniel Kahneman. And it can be nicely summarized in his book that he eventually published a long time ago, Thinking Fast and Slow. What's the very idea? So the idea is, if I'm now asking you, just point blank, which future do you expect for any kind of situation? Which dynamics might mean a certain thing? How exactly is a certain risk going to unfold? Then what you're going to do, so I'm just asking you point blank and very straightforwardly, then you're going to use what's called System 1 thinking. System 1 thinking, also fast thinking. So that is the thinking that we use in everyday speech, so to say, right? So it's the typical thing. So if I'm going to the supermarket, I'm standing in front of the fridge, I will just pick the bottle of milk that I like. I'm not going to think deeply which implication is this going to have. I'm not going to use deeper mental models. I'm just seeing a bottle of milk, and then just intuitively I'm going to take the one that seems appropriate in terms of what it looks like and which price it has. So this kind of fast thinking is what allows us to make everyday decisions. These everyday decisions, they need to be fast, they need to be efficient. And so what happens is, I don't really think. I'm not standing with a piece of paper and a pocket calculator in the supermarket and looking out to take the very best decision there actually is. But in that decision, I'm just making a quick decision based on my knowledge and based on what's called heuristics. So I'm using underlying meta models that I have everyday heuristics, everyday rules that I have to make decisions. System 1 thinking is insanely important for everyday lives. So the problem is, however, fast thinking is also a source of cognitive biases. We will come to see in a second what cognitive biases actually are. What we instead want is, we want to go towards System 2 thinking, towards so-called slow thinking. So we want to go towards thinking that is analytical, that is deliberate, that is slow. That's what we need. So when we look at these, I mean, again, when I go to the supermarket, I need to make the fastest decision possible. There's not much time I should waste on this. But when we ask ourselves how to manage risk, how is a certain situation going to unfold, then it is crucial for me to have an unbiased and analytical thinking. So System 2 thinking is eventually that's critical thinking, and that's where the so-called structured analytic techniques live. So structured analytic techniques are a set of foresight methods, or mostly foresight methods, that we use in order to activate our brains to a level that we're able to use the available information that we have to a far better degree. So System 2 thinking is also where mathematics and quantitative reasoning live. So that's the world of analytics. And many of these foresight methods, they're actually devoted to making your brain go from fast thinking to slow thinking. When we look at the so-called structured analytic techniques, are a broad toolbox of different methods that we can use to make sense of various degrees and various amounts of information in different situations. So they're mostly coming from the intelligence sector. However, we will also find them frequently used in business, in engineering, and similar. So of all this wide horizon, we're only going to look at one particular thing today, which is scenarios. At this very point, if you allow me, we'll just do a break of 5 minutes. So I'm going to fix the slides quickly, or basically the presentation itself. Let's just, so you know what it's about, let's just do a break of exactly 5 minutes, and at 10:55 CET, we're going to continue, and then we're going to have a look at what exactly are cognitive biases and how might they impact our research. So cognitive biases are eventually the result of decades of cognitive and psychological research, pointing as to the simple point that when we think about things just in a straightforward way, we actually make a lot of mistakes, and mistakes not meaning, or mistakes meaning we think to make right choice, or we think to make right assessments. Well, actually, they're not. So this image in front of you is a map of all the different cognitive biases that research has found so far, and they are far-reaching, and they basically attach to every kind of cognitive process that we have. I'm not going to keep this too long, but just to give you an idea of I just have these slides to so that you know, so they're eventually made to prime you. So when we go into a scenario workshop, then the first thing we want to do is we want to prime the scenario. We want to prime the participants. We want to have the participants at a point where they start to think, okay, maybe I need to think deeper than my everyday decision. Some prominent thing is, for instance, the anchoring effect. So the anchoring effect is a very famous effect that is used in everyday marketing. So anchoring effect, for instance, means that you will automatically, so your thinking will always be attached to the very first thing that you hear. So for instance, when I tell you, well, okay, I bought this pen for 2,000 euros. But hey, well, I'm gonna give it. How about this? I'm gonna give it to you for only 500 euros. How about this? The first reaction is going to be, well, this is a really good price. I mean, it's coming down from 2,000, and given that this is an incredibly low number. However, this is a so-called fallacy. It's a wrong way of thinking, because the question of 500 is good or bad is independent on the question if I tell you 2,000 before or not. So if I told you the original price is 600 and now I'm saying to 500, that's actually the very same transaction. It's just giving a different framing. That's what we will often see, that different framing is giving different different decisions. That's exactly what we don't want to have. Something very prominent is the idea of causality, of causality and correlation. Means that what we often see is that people confuse between two things happening at the same time, maybe just because it's random, maybe because they even have a common reason, and things actually causing each other. And this type of reasoning is, so in front of you, some examples that are obviously completely ridiculous. But think about it. Actually, people argue like this in many instances. So, for instance, we see that the higher the average temperature in a year, the higher the number of pirates. Which again, ridiculously, if you're confused between correlation and causality, could tell you that pirates actually cause global warming. Similarly, we find an interesting correlation between the number of movies made with the American actor Nicolas Cage and people drowning in U.S. swimming pools. there is, okay, this one's actually a very serious one. There is the Governance Food Index, and if we internationally list different countries and look at, okay, how tasty is their food and how good or bad is their governance, we find a surprisingly negative relationship. So we find that countries that are very well governed tend to have completely awful food, while countries that is, now we have a chat in the middle of this, okay, and we'll find that countries that are higher, that are lower in democracy or have a more complicated way of governance, tend to have much tastier food. The noticeable exception to all of this is obviously Egypt, which is badly governed and has awful food. But well, yeah. So think about causality and correlation. A completely other thing to have a look at is conjunction fallacy. So let's have a look at the following statements. So let's say, for instance, statement A: the EU breaks ties with the US. B: Iran and Saudi Arabia enter a military conflict. C: the EU and Iran broke a free trade agreement. D: the US issues sanctions against the EU, which is why the EU breaks ties with the US. E: the US joins the United States join the Iran nuclear deal again. So I'm not asking you participants, what do you think is more likely? I just want to get an assessment. So what do you think? Is statement B or E more likely? So if you think statement B is more likely, please give it a thumbs up. If you think statement E is more likely, please put your thumbs down. So okay, coming back, so we have some thumbs up, many thumbs down. Okay, so most of you think that the Iran joins the nuclear deal again is more likely than Iran, Saudi Arabia entering a military conflict. Interesting. Okay, let's go to question let's go to assessment number 2. So what do you think is more likely? Oh, this is great, thank you. So what do you think is more likely? A or D? So the EU breaks ties with the US, or the US issues sanctions against the EU, which is why the EU breaks ties with the US. So if you think statement A is more likely, give it a thumbs up. If you think statement B is more likely, please put your thumbs down. Okay, many thumbs down, a few thumbs up. Okay, so well, the first question was mainly a question of, well, generally whatever you believe to hold true about the system. The second question actually has a unique answer, which is, the answer is A. A is definitely more likely than B. Think about it. So statement A is the EU breaks ties with the US. Statement D is the EU issues sanctions against the EU, which is why the EU breaks ties with the US. Sanction A is statement A part of statement D. This is the so-called conjunction fallacy. This goes back to, I think, the 1994, 1950s with the so-called Linda bank telling problem, and this essentially tells the following. So if I presented this information to you in different style, you would have definitely seen that D needs to be, just logically speaking, D needs to be more likely than, or at least not more unlikely than number A. Yeah, while eventually framing is playing the role. And that's actually some determinant we find in most cognitive biases, that eventually people are heavily influenced by framing. People are heavily influenced by the way how I frame things. So this gives rise to a whole class of fallacies, which are largely that we as humans, we are usually not able to assess probabilities right. A major problem that will become more relevant throughout the day is groupthink. So groupthink is eventually a phenomenon that if we are inside if we work in a group, then the decisions that we make and the statements that we make, they're typically very, very prone to being wrong. What's the reason? One of them is collective rationalization. So that means if let's say for instance, let's say me, Sven, and Professor Mohammed, let's say we're a research group, and we're all day working together. And over time, what's going to happen is we're going to be in a world where we are improving each other, where we're saying, yes, okay, we're entering a world where we basically have a common imaginary of how the world works, but that is not one that is necessarily true, because eventually what happens inside a group, we're starting to get to know each other better and better and better. So we're starting a process of so-called collective rationalization. So eventually our mutual approval of each other's beliefs is creating a suggestive reality where these things become true. We share a belief in inherent morality. We gain the illusion of humanity. So that means that because we're in this group where everyone approves each other, we're getting biased and thinking that the entire world just thinks the way that we do. And eventually, what can also happen is the opposite. We can enter self-censorship. So because we're in this small group, we start to suppress certain views. So the issue of groupthink is going to be tremendously important when you eventually design scenarios, because we will discuss that later. Groupthink is the one biggest enemy to scenarios, because you do scenarios typically in small, tiny groups, and you need to be very, very aware of the issue of groupthink, and not to make your scenarios entirely irrelevant. Yeah, let's just skip all of that. So there is a bunch. There is an insane, as you remember from the map, there is an insanely large amount of different logic fallacies and cognitive biases that a good analyst needs to be aware of in order to. There should be a picture, but the picture disappeared. In order to have an unbiased. Well, in order to have his work unbiased. Let's continue and go to its understanding scenarios. So what are scenarios? Well, what scenarios are isn't really clear. So scenarios do not have, the terms scenarios themselves, they don't have a universal definition. As you will later see, there's also no new universal approach. So something that might be very important to share in the beginning. Literally everyone is doing scenarios in a very different way, and in various different contexts. So even for me, so every time I'm opening a new report, a new policy brief, a new paper on scenarios and methods for them, what I'm reading is something completely new to me. So that means if another person were to give this course, then this workshop would look very different, and the methods you would learn, they're very different. The approaches you would have a look at, they would be different. So scenarios eventually are think of the world of scenarios and futurology rather like a giant cloud of interconnected ideas, and people eventually obviously work in between all these different ideas. But we're all using different approaches, different definitions, different things. So that's maybe the one thing to have in mind. And that's also one of the things why working on scenarios never gets boring, because everyone has a so different perception of the idea. So scenarios themselves, they eventually date back to ancient Greece, where scenarios were mostly used as a form of storytelling in various contexts, and within the 20th century, so especially after World War II, scenarios finally turned into a tool for decision making. This was mainly the result of efforts by Herman Kahn and the RAND Corporation, a US-American military think tank. And Herman Kahn worked, so he started out in this military think tank and then later founded his own consultancy company. His work is perhaps the start of modern scenarios in a sense. More or less in parallel, we have Gaston Berger from founding what you could call the French scenario movement, which opposed to Hermann Kahn's idea, so was later adopted intuitive logics. So this US school of scenarios would mainly see scenarios as establishing hypothetical worlds and navigating through them, while La Prospective would see scenarios far more as a way of constructing a future. So it's a far more constructivist approach. You will later see this. I mean, all these things, they eventually mirror in today's scenario. So again, how to define them? So probably the closest thing up, again, there is no definition, but some weak consensus that we can find. So something that probably most scenario people will agree on is the following, given by Kahn and Wiener in 1967. Scenarios being hypothetical sequences of events constructed for the purpose of focusing attention on casual processes and decision points. They answer two kinds of question. Precisely, precisely how might some hypothetical situation come about step by step, and two, what alternatives exist for each actor at each step for preventing, diverting, or facilitating the process. Again, so starting out at the end of World War II, in the 1960s, we increasingly see scenarios entering the world of consultancy and private companies, and then let me call it a broad breakthrough of scenarios was eventually the 1970s, when Royal Dutch Shell, the international oil company, used scenario planning for okay, here it says prediction. This is a bad term. For foreseeing different futures of the oil market, and this eventually, as you might know, so the 1980s eventually saw a collapse of oil prices, and Royal Dutch Shell was among the companies least affected by that crash, largely due to the insight they gained from the scenario work. So this is in the late 1970s and early 1980s. That's eventually when scenario planning went into large corporations. Then from the 1980s onwards, we have this global spread of scenario planning. So let's choose a very pragmatic way of defining them. So scenarios are plausible. The term plausible will be important. We'll talk about that in a second. Scenarios are plausible imaginaries capturing counterfactual futures. What's all in there? So scenarios need to be plausible. Again, plausibility, I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. Imaginaries, meaning scenarios talk about something that has not occurred yet and that actually might never occur in that very way, because it's capturing counterfactual futures. So it's answering the question, how a certain future would look like under certain pretexts, under certain assumptions. And as such, scenarios have the aim of foreseeing the different range of futures. Now what you can see in red, so literally if you don't remember anything, so if you wake up in 2 or 3 years and say, well, I think a couple of years ago I attended this weird workshop on scenarios, and you can't remember anything, please at least remember this. So if there's no takeaway whatsoever you take from today, please at the very least take this as a takeaway. Scenarios are not prediction of the futures. Again, scenarios do not predict the futures. Prediction is a completely different branch of methods. So prediction is, for instance, what you gain from looking at time series. So if you whatever, say you use a VAR model to estimate the deep relation between some variables, and then you're using that to forecast something, that's prediction. That's prediction. So prediction means that you are giving one specific, very precise guess for the future, and it is the most probable guess for the future. So if you need to pick one and say, what's the most probable thing, what's the most likely thing to happen tomorrow, that is prediction. Scenarios are not made to predict. That's not their idea. why is that the reason? So one of them is, again, why do we need something beyond prediction? So one of them is, as Annie, I think we have some quantitative researchers with us today. So as you might know, so obviously, A, the weaker the data is, and B, the more complex your interactions are, and C, most importantly, the further you want to go into the future, the worse any kind of predictive model gets. So try to use a time series model to predict oil prices for tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. That might still work. Try to use the time series model to predict oil prices after 10 years, and what you're getting is simple crap. So that's one of the points. So we need to have methods that are able to cope with long-term developments, with that have a very uncertain and complex underlying relationships and a lot of bad data. That's where scenarios live. Consider the idea of the scenarios aim at capturing the range of the future. What does it mean? So it means that a prediction means, okay, this, so the straight middle, that's what's going to happen today. That's probably going to happen. Scenarios, instead, they look at the range. So they look at what are all the different possibilities that we can imagine for tomorrow. And as such, think if you're from a quantitative background, think of it like confidence intervals in inductive statistics and inference. The very idea that we say, okay, a point estimate is a precise thing. We all love point estimates, but in the end, we know that given that there is an underlying random process, a point estimate can never be true. It's literally the probability. So if we have in over a continuous domain, the probability that your point estimate is going to be true is exactly 0. So instead, for instance, we work with confidence intervals. We say that it's far more interesting to say what's the range of different values that we can envision, rather than just saying what's the very point that we expect to see. And as such, offering point predictions to highly uncertain events, that's actually misleading, and that actually can make decision making significantly worse. So when I'm running a business, when I'm running a country, when I'm making any kind of decision making, and I'm just looking to be guided by the most probable future, yeah, that means at the very same time that I will be unprepared for everything but that very future, which is actually bad. If I'm running a company, if I'm running an organization, a country, whatever, I actually need to be prepared for the whole range of different futures that can happen. On the right hand side, you can see an image pointing us to the very, very first idea of how scenarios actually work. So when you look at scenarios, then what we typically read and what we see as are the events. So we see that a scenario is a series of events that unfolds. But the actual depth of scenarios lies in what's underneath that. So eventually scenarios work on a very deep understanding of the patterns of behavior and system structures that underlie the information that we have. Let's focus more on this term of. So, but by the way, this is such a monologue. Do you have any if you have any questions at the moment? So again, please just if you have any question, please just raise your hand, or please just type a message into the chat, and then feel free to speak. So whatever works better for you. But again, please, this shouldn't be a monologue. So whenever you have any kind of question, feel free to interrupt me at any point in time. It's actually much appreciated. It gives me a second to rest. No, so if you have any question, really interrupt me at any point. So let's have a look at this term plausibility. So most of what we need to understand about scenarios in the very, very first instance is captured in this wonderful conceptual graph. So this thing which you see in front of you is sometimes called the scenario cone. Sometimes it's called the cone of uncertainty. Sometimes it's called the future cone. So this thing has many different terms, although all basically mean the same. So think about the left-hand side. So think about the start of that projection being where we are at the moment. So this is today. And we now think of the future. So the more we go to the right-hand side, the further we go into the future. So obviously, what happens now if I ask, okay, what are the different futures that I can imagine for tomorrow? Then, well, it's a lot, but it's limited. But when I think of, okay, what are the different futures that I can imagine for, say, 1 year from now? It's even more. A lot could change within a year. And if I now think, okay, which different futures can I envision for 10 years from now? Then this number is obviously even larger. So that's the idea. Yes, I don't hear any breaking sound. Sorry, is my connection all right? I hope so. Eventually, the further we go into the future, the larger the sphere of uncertainty becomes. All right. So think of the magnitude of that cone, implying uncertainty. How to understand scenarios within this framework? So think about the boundaries of this cone. So the most extreme visions of the future that I could have, they're impossible. So say, for instance, we're thinking of a future where in, say, 5 years from now, mankind has found the solution to the energy crisis. That's about this. Okay, let's say something better. Let's say in 5 years from now, we have developed a technology that is able to generate more electricity than it consumes. Then we'll say, yes, okay, this is a future that we can talk about, but it's a future that's literally impossible because that's against the very, very rules of physics that we have. All right. So on the boundary of this cone, we have ideas that are simply impossible. That cannot happen. That's just violating the very, very laws of physics, of societies, of everything that we know. If you go a little bit closer on this cone, then we go into a sphere of things that are possible. They're not necessarily likely, but they're possible. So, say for instance, we're thinking of a future where in 5 years, China is ruling the entire world. So a future in 5 years where China is the entire world lives under the command of China. Is that physically impossible? Is it physically impossible that happens? No, it isn't. Is that a scenario that we will find, that we expect? So can we really expect to live within 5 years, China taking over the entire world? Well, rather not. And that is exactly what we find in between the blue and the green cone. So within the green cone, we have what's called plausible. I will not go through the definition of the term plausibility, simply because the term plausibility itself is a very disputed and contested term. Think of plausibility for a second as something being possible. So something that's plausible, needs to be possible. That's the first condition. And the second condition is something that's plausible, needs to adhere to an underlying logic. So you need to be able to, so so it's typically, in under US law, you often have this term, what would a reasonable person think? So this is you can think of the term plausibility coming to that. So can we think of reasonable trajectory can we think of a trajectory that's not completely crazy, that would lead us there? So for instance, let's say in 5 years from now, we find that many parts of the United Nations are severely dysfunctional and do not work anymore. That's an extreme scenario, it is. But is it really implausible? Not necessarily. We can think of tensions in multiple countries, maybe due to COVID, escalating more and more. As a result, these countries opting out of UN. UN becomes more and more of a very one-sided body, which is why countries stop funding it. As a result, in 5 years, there's, factually speaking, no working UN anymore. Again, it's a very extreme scenario, but it's a scenario. It's a future that I can reach within the limits of what a reasonable person might expect to hold true. So think of plausibility again. So plausible means that it needs to be possible, and there needs to be a non-crazy way how to reach this future. We've often used the term scenario now without actually depicting what it means. Before coming to this, so in the very, very center of that cone, we would have the most probable future. A mistake that many people make, so when they think of the most probable future, I think the most probable future, so typically dubbed business as usual, would mean that we just take what we have and say, okay, it's the same in 20 years. That's actually not the probable future. So probable future means that all the trends that we see at the moment, they're unchanged. So all the drivers, everything, the entire, so not the system itself is copied, but the trends of how the system moves, they just copied into the future. And that's the most probable future. It's the most probable future, the future that is basically, I'm just walking along the current trends that I see, more or less linearly into the future. So what's a scenario now? So a scenario is one precise way to go from the point where we're at today towards the future. So each of these dots here, so every dot on the scenario cone is a final state for a scenario. So obviously, how many scenarios can I have? I can have an infinite amount of number of final states, and also I can have an infinite amount of different trajectories through the system. So obviously, you can think of an infinite amount of different scenarios. So again, scenarios being one precise pathway throughout the future, reaching a final state. So again, we'll typically limit our analysis to plausible futures. So we unless you're in well, some science fiction, so some artwork might be interested in impossible futures. So how would a world look like in 20 years if suddenly a certain law of physics wouldn't be there anymore? You can find that in art. There might be some people, for whatever reason, being interested in implausible but possible futures. However, so we in kind of political context and business context, we will always be interested in plausible futures and plausible scenarios. Very often we're interested in looking at a best case or a worst case. What's the idea of that? So this is now the entire story in a nutshell. Scenarios help me. I mean, if you think of this entire code as all the different stuff that could happen in the future. Think of a very, very good. So if we once believed that the term that prediction was able, or forecasting methods were able to achieve similar results than scenarios. So this here in the center the most probable future, that's what a prediction is trying to get. Okay, so prediction is trying to get you to get the very, very center of this picture. However, think you're a decision maker again, and say you're only preparing for this very center. Well, actually, while the center is the most maybe improbable thing to happen, all of this stuff within the green zone can also be expected to happen. That can happen. So eventually what scenarios are doing, scenarios are finding characteristic points within this cone, within this set of plausible futures, to say that, okay, say for instance, this down here, that's one extreme yet plausible thing that can happen. Say, can you actually see my cursor if I move it? You probably can't, right? Okay, then let me rather draw. I'm using my cursor all the time, and effectively it doesn't work. Let me. Okay, this is yeah. So
Yes,
oh,
now we can see.
yeah, that would work. Okay, so again, so the entire green set is the entire green circle is what is plausible in the future. This here in the center is the most probable version of the future. So this here, for instance, could be a best case. So your scenario should be deliberately extreme. Why is that the case? You want to get a hold on this entire set. So you want to know what's between this extreme and that extreme. That's what you want to know. Because think of it, everything here in the middle, everything here in the center is just in some way or another a combination of the things that happen at these extremes. Right? So that's why, so what I often like to explain to my students is, think of, well, when setting a scenario world, think of it like you have a completely dark room in front of you, okay? So imagine in front of you this dark room, zero light. And now you need to make a decision where to go. So what a prediction is doing, a prediction is telling you, just go into, just take one step ahead, but you have no idea what happens further. And now, okay, you need to make decisions in this dark room. You obviously only have a limited number of resources. So say you only have 2 flashlights or 3 flashlights, not more. It's a big room, you only have 3 flashlights. Where are you going to direct these flashlights? Many people would think, or people who argue that we should look at the most probable future are telling you we should take all 3 flashlights and just center them. We just take all 3 flashlights and look into the center. Well, the result is you have a lot of exposure on the center of the room. Yes, you will know a lot about the center of the room. However, you're not going to know anything about 90% of the room. You're focusing all your resources on 10%. And if whatever you're looking for, say you're looking for your pen, if your pen is not in this 10% of the room, then you have an issue. So what scenarios are doing, instead scenarios are saying, okay, you take one flashlight and point it to the right. You take another flashlight and point to the left. And you take one flashlight and you put it in the middle, into the center. This way, okay, the entire room is going to stay mostly dark. And if your pen is anywhere in between, well, it might not be that great. So your pen is not necessarily at the very point you spot it at. However, it will maximize your access to the room. So by spreading the light through the room, by taking one light here, one light there, one light there, you will eventually have the best. It's the best strategy when it comes to get a grip on the room. And that's what scenarios are doing. So scenarios are our way of getting a grip on this entire cone. So to get to know the large variety of different things that could happen. Lastly, we have so-called wildcard scenarios. So wildcard scenarios are scenarios. Let's assume that at some point, something really abrupt is happening. So let's say at some point there is a certain event, not an underlying trend, but an event that completely throws the world off the rails. So natural disasters are in scenario making classical and conventional wildcards. So things that really no one could have foreseen because they just were not available in the system, but they change the role of the system entirely. Some of these wildcards may obviously end in implausible futures, but some wildcards, however, may end in very plausible futures. So at this point, this slide is really important to me. Do you guys have any questions on the notion of plausibility, on the notion of the scenario cone, on what exactly we're looking at? Any questions? All right. So we covered most of that. So why do we actually use scenarios? So we use scenarios when we have complex situations, very uncertain outcomes, and they're too uncertain to trust just a single prediction. Policy-wise, so we do that when corporate strategies or policies when they're still very initial stages. So while we're inside an operation, we're not going to use scenarios. We will use scenarios to influence policies or strategies that are still in the making. Our aim is to bound the range of possible futures. And one central thing, this is something that people often forget. Sometimes scenarios aren't just means to an end, but sometimes the process of making scenarios itself can be very valuable. So I know from other colleagues in who work in international development that when you have, for instance, conflict between different communities, when you have stakeholders having conflict with each other, in all these cases, just bringing all of these people together for preparing scenarios can be very helpful to facilitate conflict resolution. So besides that, what are other goals of scenarios? So again, providing a framework for considering multiple plausible futures, obtaining indicators. So not today, but tomorrow, we're going to talk about indicators. So think of, so have in mind all the so a part on communicating scenarios, or to gain from scenarios. We're going to do that tomorrow a little more. They help us anticipating developments that would otherwise be surprising. And obviously, when looking at a scenario, so when looking at one of these paths, so when looking at one of these paths, I will eventually be able to think about which risks do I have, but also which opportunities arise. So how can I use this path for the better? How can I influence the path for the better? I know this is getting a bit dry at this point, but eventually after the after the big break we're going to do in about an hour, this is all getting more interactive again. If you haven't got wildcards, exactly, yes. So I just read now, okay. So wildcards means, so again, so a scenario, let's start here maybe. So the true thing that guides scenarios are underlying behavior. So we'll later talk about drivers. Scenarios basically mean that, let me explain it here. So we are now here, okay? And we now say that one specific trend develops. So think, for instance, of our scenario explains a world in which technology innovation is just faster as it was before, okay? So our driver is innovation, and we're looking at a future in which innovation comes much faster, not much, but in which innovation happens very fast, okay? And then a scenario would explain to me, okay, we just walk along this line and see, okay, how would this world that has more innovation, how would it look like? Okay, that's a scenario that basically, if you're thinking from the start to the end, it's all just the result of underlying mechanics and the drivers I put in here. Okay, so think of it like we're at this very point, and now we're defining how a world should look like, and then we're just pushing it into that direction, and the scenario walks by itself. It just walks by by the underlying mechanisms that we define. A wildcard, opposed to that, means that we say, okay, we don't say, okay, we just say we're in a world, we're walking along a path of a world that has more innovation on its way, but we're saying something very sudden happens, something that does not necessarily occur here, something that's not just a trend. We assume some sudden and unexpected event occurs. So instead of saying I'm just in a world that has a bit more innovation, say suddenly there is a completely new technology that no one has ever thought about, and it changes the world entirely. Think of a natural disaster. So say that in the past, think of, for instance, Fukushima. So the tsunami that led to the meltdown in a Japanese nuclear power plant that eventually altered nuclear energy policy in many countries throughout the world. So this is not an endogenous process. This is not underlying mechanics working the way to the future, but it's a sudden event that basically shifts your world onto another trajectory. Right, so that's what a wildcard is. So a wildcard is, literally speaking, a wildcard is a low probability, high impact event that disrupts your system. Understood?
Dawood, can you give also an example of something like this that you explained?
Wildcards?
Yes. Low probability.
Yes, so again, so wildcards could be, Sure. So again, the most obvious example are natural disasters. So think of let's connect to climate change. So let's say a standard example would be, okay, if we see how does climate change develop, and we could say it's the usual driver, something that would happen over time, would be say, okay, people are more aware of climate change, or there's new technology or whatever. But then a wildcard would be a sudden event. So say, for instance, a large firestorm suddenly erupts. It's nothing that people could have spotted before. It's nothing that comes over time, but it just suddenly happens, and then it changes the course drastically and suddenly. So again, natural disasters of all kinds are typically wildcards. Sudden new technologies can be wildcards. In certain cases, conflict can be a wildcard. What else? Eventually, wildcards are not receiving the attention they should these days. But typically, disasters, really new technology, conflict. That's the pandemic. So here's the point. So the pandemic, to a large extent, so we need to say both. It's a completely true thing. So the pandemic was a wild card. Very good. So the pandemic was anticipated. So it means people anticipated there is the chance that there could be a pandemic, but that the pandemic finally entered the world, that's definitely a wild card. So it's a sudden event that in this very form wasn't expected. And then, so it had a low probability. So people said, researchers said, so such an event is going to occur within the next 100 years. But no one knew how exactly it's going to happen. No one knew when exactly it's going to happen. And it shifted the world completely from one trajectory to another. Very good example. So when looking at the different forms of scenarios, so here we still, I mean, even beyond that, it's very unclear what scenarios are, but we can work somewhat to its taxonomy of scenarios. Perhaps the most important, perhaps the two most important different kinds of scenarios that start over here is the question whether scenarios are explanatory or normative. So we will today mostly talk about explanatory scenarios. So scenarios that are working on a counterfactual. So again, saying, okay, it's now 2020 and something happens. It can be a wildcard that happens. It can just be a slow burning driver that unfolds. But so something happens, and then we're looking at, okay, how will this affect the future over the next 20 years? Opposed to that are normative futures, normative scenarios. So normative scenarios, they ask, how does the future need to change in order to come to a certain result? So normative scenarios are particularly prominent in the climate change community. So people doing scenarios asking, okay, what are the path, or what is a path that we can take in order to achieve the 1.5 or 2 or whatever degree target by whatever year? So people say, okay, it's in 2040 emissions should be 0, for instance, and now we're establishing a scenario. So I know where I'm today, I know the future, and now we're looking for a line to connect these two. Okay, so exploratory scenarios, think of it, we know today. We choose a certain angle, we choose a driver, and then the scenario just goes into the direction, and we see where do we land. Maybe at a good place, maybe at a bad place, no one knows. A normative scenario starts at a point and ends at a certain point, and then we look for the path between. Something interesting for us today is, again, so we just dubbed this, we already dipped into this by talking about wildcards. So especially in this natural disaster world, we need to distinguish what is here called trend risk and shock risk scenarios. So trend risk being, again, so I have an underlying process. I have again, I have these latent drivers. So I have change happening over time. So in a natural disaster world, again, so think of climate change. So think of, you're looking at how does a continuously increasing temperature affect the community? How does the increasing destruction of land impact the community?
I have a question.
That's here on the right. Yes.
Under
yeah, sure.
which situation we tend to use more normative, and under which scenario we tend to go for exploratory?
Sure. So we typically, we typically go to its explanatory scenarios if we want to bound the different futures. So if we say, okay, we have a situation, we have no idea how this thing can turn out, and we're just interested in learning what are all the different options that are possible. The normative scenario is something we use if we know where we want to be. So that's the notion of normativity here. So we know we want to be at a certain stage. So again, think of, we want to be in a world that is whatever. We want to be in a world where a certain conflict has stopped, or we want to be in a world where a certain climate change goal is reached, something like that. And now we're just reaching for, okay, what's a feasible way to get there? So if we know where we want to get, we're looking for a way how to get there, then we're using a normative scenario. When we are in a situation where we just want to know, okay, what are different things that can happen? How can the future actually look like? Or how will it look like if something happens? Then we're on the explanatory side of things. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, normative, exactly. So normative scenarios, you could also call them targeted scenarios. Exactly. So normative scenarios are scenarios that have an explicit target. So you define the target before defining the way there. Completely true. So again, trend risk scenarios being scenarios that cover that cover things happening over time, so hazards happening over time, developments happening over time. Well, shock risk scenarios are scenarios, okay, what happens if a sudden event happens? So go and think of here the left-hand side, so trend risk scenario, thank you. So trend risk scenarios being scenarios, okay, a community has every year less and less access to water. How is this going to change the world? And a shock scenario, a community is suddenly hit by an earthquake. Perhaps that's the most graphic way to differentiate them. When thinking about how to do the scenarios, so we'll talk about, again, developing scenarios is the next section. But generally, so scenarios can be rather bottom up. So it can be that we produce knowledge by asking people. So especially in development context, that's what's often going to happen. So say we have this. So let's just go. So let's just develop something. Say, okay, we want to learn how a certain community is affected by having less and less water. So say due to, again, just sticking to the example because it's easy. So let's say due to climate change, a community has less and less water available every year. We want to find out how different choices that we make today can affect the future. And now we can make this participatory. So we can say, okay, we learn about how the world, so how would a world look like in which they have less and less water each year? And we ask the community itself. So we're doing participative workshops with them. We are inviting them. We're doing interviews. So we're doing these. So we're asking bottom up. We're asking the community itself. Or we use an expert-driven process. So we use experts, people who are not in this community, but experts on the issue, who have quantitative models, for instance, and to just say top down, okay, that's what's going to happen to the community. Then lastly, our scenarios can be probabilistic or deterministic. That's rather a numerical property, so a property that rather applies to the quantitative side of things. Okay, so again, brief recap. Our main different classes of scenarios are scenarios that are either trend risks or scenarios that have hazards and developments that materialize over time, so slow working drivers, slow working trends, or we have a sudden thing, okay? Land decreases every year versus earthquake. They can be explanatory or normative, so explanatory, how would the community look like if it had less and less access to water, versus the community needs to have water in year 2040, how to reach that. They can be participatory. I ask people bottom up how for their opinion to generate knowledge, or I can have experts to do that. Are they combined forms? Short answer, yes. Long answer. First, again, so this is there is unfortunately, I actually like that. There is a multitude of different approaches, different ways, different concepts of scenarios. So everything is highly mixed. So perhaps the largest difference is still going to be here, maybe. So you would typically not mix a trend risk and a shock risk scenario, at least not largely. Obviously, you will have shared elements. So also a shock, so also an earthquake, so also a scenario that has an earthquake can later look at how different things unfold. So let's say I do have an earthquake, and now I'll look at, okay, how does the earthquake over time develop if the community is, say, more prone to conflict or less prone to conflict over time. So there can be some mixture, but I won't start off with an earthquake and at the very same time, I'm looking at the community getting more or less water or something like this. So this is probably the most dichotomized thing. Explanatory and normative scenarios are completely different in theory, but in practice there's a very, very large overlap. Think of our notion of a best case scenario. So there's no discussion, but it is up to now a very strange question. So is a best case scenario explanatory, or can it actually be, is it automatically normative? By I'm saying I'm looking at a best case, can that actually be explanatory? Or am I not actually already defining the end state in which I'm in? So that's more complicated. On this point here, definitely. So that is the point where you actually should honestly. So a good scenario process should see these two worlds combined. So you want to have bottom-up knowledge to generate to gain knowledge from people in the field, but at the same time you also want to have experts who use strong quantitative models. You want to have both. Further questions on this taxonomy? All right. So qualitative and quantitative scenarios. So again, as we know, so the idea of scenarios is rather coming from this from this qualitative idea of ordering very complex and uncertain sets of data. However, and obviously, scenarios can also be very quantitative. So outside the disaster world, and that's also, as you might have read the introduction, so I'm mainly working on the energy sector actually, and in the energy sector, mixing quantitative and quantitative methods is still something that is very hard to the sector apparently. So you have people working only qualitative, only quantitative, and whenever they do a mix, it's most likely awful. We'll cover that in a couple of seconds, but actually in the disaster community, the dual usage of quantitative and qualitative scenarios is widespread and also very important. So what's the on the right hand side? Just have an example I took from a quite recent paper outlining their particular approach to its using explanatory scenarios in disaster risk management. And so what they have, for instance, so they start out here with a qualitative process, right? And then eventually, as soon as they have the qualitative process, they enter their qualitative process into modeling. And then the modeling is feeding back into the process, and you have an iterative process. So typically when you mix quantitative and quantitative. So let me give you a precise example. So let's say now you're doing. I don't want to use an example that we have later. Yeah, let's use COVID. Let's use COVID as an example. So you make a scenario for a future pandemic. Then typically you're going to start out on the qualitative side. Okay, so you're going to start out establishing a scenario as a series of events. You want to see how this sudden event would impact the system. So you establish all your qualitative ideas. And then what's going to happen is you will take the scenario which you have and you will take key parameters from it. So for instance, your qualitative scenario defines where does the pandemic occur, how fast does it spread. You have that from the qualitative side of things. You translate it into the model, you put it into a model, and you let the model suggest you numbers. So you do a simulation of how this pandemic would unfold, how many people would die, and so on. Then you take that information, you take the information you have from the models, and you feed it back into the qualitative side. So you see, okay, here I have my storyline, there I have numbers. Do the two of them match? If the answer is no, you will now update your storyline to fit the numbers. Then you probably have some new parameters which you again will feed into your model, and then you will again compare. Okay, do my model results again? Do they cover the storyline? Yes or no? So you will have an iterative process where the modeling side helps you to gain more insight on or not to gain more insight, what helps you to be more robust, to make more robust statement with respect to these things that that can be captured by a model. So that's the point. Highly complex social interactions cannot be easily captured in a model. Capturing how a pandemic spreads, capturing how how a hurricane unfolds, capturing how an earthquake is going to affect a region, that are actually things that we can capture in a model. That's the whole reason why we have these respective departments. So you're going to take this abstract and qualitative things, and then wherever you can make use of a simulation model to make your idea of how the event, how the disaster unfolds more robust, you're going to use a simulation for that. And then you will compare your simulation results with your storyline and adjust them. And you will continue this process until you have one combined narrative of that are both qualitative and quantitative. Yeah, so because this is so I deliberately set up this workshop as disaster management and beyond. So we'll also look at some other fields. Such scenarios are very prominent in the energy industry. So here you have examples of some of the most prominent so-called energy outlooks. So you have, for instance, the International Energy Agency, you have government and non-government bodies, you have private companies, you have research institutions setting up global energy scenarios, or scenarios that tell you how energy and climate are going to develop over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And these scenarios, they're very, very impactful. So eventually, people make investment decisions. So business people make investment decisions. Policymakers design policies. NGOs direct much of their work towards the information they gain from these scenarios. So I have other courses where I do have it here. Yeah. So I have at some schools I teach courses particularly targeting energy scenarios and how they're done. It's a complicated, it's a complicated field because eventually the practice of energy scenarios tends to be quite far from actually started. So think about so we started this section here by explaining of what scenarios are, so these deep counterfactuals. In many scenarios, we don't find that anymore. So in many scenarios, we find that scenarios have rather become just a modeling exercise. And that's if you go even more, so perhaps the IPCC, so the International Panel on Climate Change, is perhaps the worst institution when it comes to that. As just regarding scenarios as a mere set of parameters in a modeling exercise, which is actually one of the reasons why, if you look at the projections that these global energy outlooks make, they're sometimes pretty bad. So here two examples on the left hand side is the Energy Information Agency, so the U.S. Energy Ministry, basically the U.S. Department for Energy. And on the right hand side, you have the International Energy Agency, OECD, an OECD body, and their projections. So on the left hand side, we have the forecasts for coal consumption. On the right hand side, we have solar energy, for instance, and we see how each and every year, so the black line in each case is how the numbers really unfolded, and these colored lines are their year-by-year projections, and we see how these projections actually got worse by the year. And one of the reasons that we find, so I'm doing research on also on the process of making scenarios. One of the reasons is that many of these scenarios have completely lost touch with the basis of what scenarios actually are. So they don't really have a qualitative, so they have no qualitative side anymore. So if you look at these scenarios, then you will typically not find a storyline. You won't find an elaboration of how does the world develop. You just find people crunching in random numbers and getting numbers out.
Yeah, so this is good. This is now going to be interesting. I would like to open a link. Okay, there is something. Yes, good. So this is eventually an exercise undertaken by the Johns Hopkins School for Public Health in 2019. So Modi SARS by the German CDC was the closest thing to, was most accurate. Again, so we've learned by now that scenarios are not meant to be accurate, but the one that ironically came closest to the truth. However, there were numerous exercises that actually, scenario exercises that actually looked at pandemics, of SARS-type pandemics unfolding in the near future. One very influential and good one was eventually this one. I'm just briefly walk you through some sections of this, just to get a notion of how does such a scenario report look like. So welcome to the SPARS pandemic. So this is a scenario again by Johns Hopkins University, set for a SARS-type pandemic in 2025 to 2028. So such a scenario report is obviously, so you want to tell the people why you're doing this, and what's the basic setup that you're in. So again, scenarios, especially in the disaster community, they can look fairly different depending on your purpose, depending on what you want to achieve with it. But this is, in my opinion, an example for a very well done scenario. So again, in the end, a scenario, think of it like, or the most classic, the most conventional way of presenting a scenario is you're presenting a scenario in a similar type as if you were to, as if you were to be at the end, at the final state, and you were to write a history book. Okay, so think of it like a history. Think of it like a history textbook for the future. So a scenario starts out at a starting date. So here we eventually start in the future. So this thing starts in 2025. But so for most of our cases, scenarios will start in the present. So scenarios start out either at some point where we see, so if we have a trend risk scenario, so scenarios will start at a point and then gradually see their drivers unfolding. Sparse is, let me maybe ask you just to see this. So again, this report is covering the eventuality of a SARS-type disease hitting the US in 2025, and it sees what will happen. Is this a normative or is it an explorative scenario? Just to see if we're right on the terms. So if you think it's exploratory, please give me an approve. If you think it's normative, please give me disapprove. So is this an exploratory scenario or is this a normative scenario? Yes, very good. As most of you say, exactly, it's an exploratory scenario. So the scenario doesn't say, I want to be somewhere in 2030, but it says, okay, something happens and I want to see how does it affect the future. That's an exploratory scenario. B, is this a trend risk? Or is it sorry, I usually use different terms in my publications. Is it a shock risk or is it a trend risk scenario? Is it a shock risk? Please give me approval. Or is it a trend risk scenario? Please give me disapproval. Shock risk or trend risk? Very good. It's a shock risk scenario. So it's a scenario that is not looking at how do certain underlying drivers change a system over time, but it's looking at how the system react to a sudden change, to a sudden disruption. So these shock risk scenarios, so they will typically start by explaining the very events, the very event where everything starts. So here in this case, it's mid-October 2025, and suddenly 3 people in the Twin Cities, so in Minneapolis, suddenly die from a previously unknown disease. And then what the report is doing, it's writing the series of events. So how does this situation unfold over time in form of storyline? So what is done very well here is this type of scenarios, so especially shock risk scenarios, you want to make them vivid, because in the end, again, we talk more about communication tomorrow, but you want to make stakeholders and policymakers aware of the risk. So they really made the story very vivid. So as you can see here, so there is a fictive newspaper article. There are imaginary Twitter posts by the CDC that is doing 2 things. So having such elements in your story creates 2 very important outcomes. So one of them is, again, it's making the story very vivid and very believable. And on the other hand, and that's the most important thing, plausibility requires you to be consistent. It requires you to look beyond the system. So think back of this iceberg model that we have of the events that are covered. They're just the top of the scenario. The really important point is everything that's below. It's all the underlying mechanisms. And so one especially important side of scenarios is, how do social systems react to the developments? How does society as a whole, how does media, how does the economy, how do politics, how do these things react to the crisis or to the developments that you have in your model? And so if you're able to do something like that, so if you're able to give me credible fake posts by the CDC as part of your scenario, that's a really good sign that you have a good understanding of how this crisis would impact the underlying culture. So, and then obviously again, so eventually you can do scenarios just for your personal interest, but typically you do scenarios to affect decision making. And so what they do in this report is, after each and every chapter, they eventually see that, okay, they take this scenario and they see within the scenario certain problems arise. So here, for instance, and particularly, they say there's a communication dilemma. So people don't really trust the CDC advice. People don't trust information you give out when you still don't know enough about the virus. How to tackle this? So yes, ironically, if anyone would have taken this report seriously, COVID-19 wouldn't have been such a pain in the ass for the US. But yeah, so they eventually give. So you can do it at the end. That's one option. So they do it after each and every chapter. They give you what exactly are the problems, or what are the challenges that we see, and potentially also how can good decision making in this situation actually solve them. And then from here on again, so the whole scenario is more and more unfolding and analyzing with a lot of, again, very vivid material. How does the situation unfold over time? Let's move to the second example. Any questions so far? I guess I'm just showing you these 3 examples so you haven't so you get a glimpse of how a good practice of how scenario reports are done, how good scenarios actually look like, and also the power that they can have. I mean, think of yourself being a decision maker and receiving this this document. It makes you want it has an impact on your decision making. So this is it's really that black. It's not. It's really that black. A different example. So this is a report by Lloyd's on food system shock, the insurance impacts of acute disruption to global food supply. So typically, the other one didn't have that, but typically your reports are going to start with an executive summary. So typically you want to summarize both the scenarios and what we can learn from the scenarios in the start of a report. And then again, we're back into this this narrative world where where eventually, where the scenario itself. So again, we can have an introduction, giving people the idea of everything, but then we will at some point go into the storyline, where we see how all the events eventually unfold. Again, good scenarios should not only build on storylines, but they should use vivid imaginary. They should use maps. So anything that makes your point more, that makes your point better. That is two reasons. So using something like a map is two reasons. A, it makes it easier to understand your story, and second, a paper which I'm going to share tomorrow has recently analyzed that the more quantitative or semi-quantitative looking stuff you give in a scenario report, so the more you build on, well, anything that looks scientific, the more readers will perceive your scenario to be plausible. Again, and then you can see, so this report, for instance, again, so we start with precise events, and then see how do these events change over time. What is really noticeable here is that, so this is a report, and that's again something that good scenarios will do. Good scenarios will look far beyond the initial realm they started in. So this thing starts off by talking about agriculture, but eventually then moves on towards making statements about the global economy, about how society is affected, and so on. And then the end, what we have here is alternative responses. So these disaster scenarios, we will talk about that after the break. Disaster scenarios typically live from analyzing counterfactuals. How would the system develop if I had adopted a certain decision at the start? How could different infrastructure have mitigated or exacerbated the problem, and so on. Briefly moving on to example number 3. This was only 4 megabytes. That should be quick. So what I'm opening now is no. So again, scenarios are not supposed to are not even supposed to. So here's the point. Never forget that a scenario is only meant to represent a specific class of futures. So if the scenario was meant, so a scenario doesn't even aim at saying when does a pandemic begin. So so this very precise predictive question: when does something happen? To which extent does it happen? This is what you would rather take up with prediction. The idea of a scenario is far more to give you the generic case of how a pandemic unfolds, so you can be generally prepared for a pandemic. And by the way, the report was from 2019, so prior to COVID-19. So this is a report that, or this is a set of scenarios that we developed between 2016 and 2019. It's called the DWREM outlook. So it's an interdisciplinary energy outlook. This is one of the few energy outlooks that is pretty good in, at least I hope it's pretty good, in bringing qualitative and quantitative things together. So on the one hand, so we do have events. So if you have different events, you can typically represent them as a timeline. So to give people what are really important things to happen over time. And then on the other hand, okay, this is a lot of scrolling now. So this is now completely different. Okay, let me start here. This is a completely different approach. This, in that sense, it's not a shock risk, but now we have trend risk scenarios. So what's going to happen in these trend risk scenarios, we will typically not talk about one scenario and its alternatives, but we will talk about different scenarios. Typically, when you talk about trend risks, or when you talk about underlying driver changes, you will have multiple scenarios within one study. Typically 3 to 4, where one might be at the center of the cone and 2 might be at the extremes of the cone and 1 might be a wild card. So business as usual, best case, worst case, and some wild card. So this report this study here is giving 4 different scenarios of the global energy system to its 2050. And so here you can see how these things interact again. So we have events unfolding to its 2050, and we have alongside the events we have precise understanding of how do quantitative indicators change over time. Let me scroll down to yeah, so typically such a dual report will then allow you to compare the trajectories between different scenarios. So this is giving you a different type of counterfactualism, by saying, okay, so given that the future depends in either direction, these are different extremes that we can imagine. So in this specific case, I really need to go to the bottom of this thing. So such scenarios, they will need to be very explicit, about the so-called assumptions they take. So we'll talk about all this. So this is just, again, to be an illustration for you. We'll talk about these terms in detail after the break. So such scenarios, they will need to be quite explicit about which assumptions they take. So what are the underlying rules? What's the underlying behavior of the system? And then here's the keyword drivers. So in these trend risk scenarios, we don't have a sudden event that happens. We don't just have an earthquake. We don't have a sudden blizzard or whatever. But we have underlying things that change, so-called drivers. So they could be the rate of innovation. That could be medium high, very high. We have the state of security. So how stable is the geopolitical environment? So we have all these uncertain factors that could influence the energy system. The energy system is influenced by the question, how coherent is social welfare? How much international cooperation is there? And so scenarios are then defined by one particular set of drivers. So think of these drivers, if you're more from a quantitative point of view, think of these drivers as being variables. And your scenario tells you, how does the world look like in case I have one specific set of drivers being active? Okay, so here in these trend risk scenarios, we don't have an event that happens, but we have particular drivers realizing, or being realized. Yeah, perhaps that's no. Okay, I want to show you one more thing. We're going to talk about that element tomorrow. One important thing that we can get in these trend risk scenarios are indicators. So indicators are the most prominent example for early warning systems. So given that we have these scenarios, we can then define indicators that can tell neutral observers which, or if any, which of those. So okay, it's not about which scenario unfolds, but what's the direction that we're moving in. So these indicators will be neutral warning signs that can tell an observer, okay, are we rather moving into that direction, or is the world rather moving into that direction? So these indicators, that's what we're going to deal with indicators tomorrow. That is something that we can do after finishing a scenario.